December 17th, 1977, Council Bluffs, Iowa. 24-year-old Mike Moore was driving through Big Lake Park with his wife around 7:45 p.m. when suddenly they spotted something extraordinary. There, in the sky, was something odd. They at first thought it was an airplane from a nearby airfield in Omaha, but this thing hovered, and while it hovered, it dropped something down to the ground. Something in flames. Mike would state that it looked like a ball of red fire, which was dropped from a high point in the sky and then the craft flew off. Now if this was it wouldn't be much of a mystery. But there were more sightings. Around the same time, a group of teenagers were cruising in town when they seen a reddish object about 500 to 600 feet in the air fall straight to the ground. They then seen it disappear behind the trees as it dropped, and then they seen a flash of a bluish-white light and two arms of flame shoot up, suggesting that an impact had been made. They would then head towards the park, and there they pulled up behind a couple in their car, a Kenny and Carol Drake, who had also come to see what it was that had fallen. When both parties got out to look, they seen a glowing orange blob which had a bluish crystalline substance in its center. The lava-like material sat on an embankment about 16 feet from the road, and it was running down into a ditch as it appeared to be cooling. It was super hot, and they couldn't get very close, and it actually started a small grass fire. It was about this time that the fire department was contacted, and they arrived on scene 15 minutes later to find a still glowing molten metal which covered a 6 by 4 foot area that was 4 inches thick. The assistant fire chief, Jack Moore, stated that it was a mass of molten metal which ran down the edge of a levee boiling along the way. He also stated the metal was so hot it looked like blue flash bulbs. The assistant fire chief would request the police, who also didn't know what to make of it. Once it cooled down some, they were able to get closer and observe that it was for sure a kind of metal, but they could not break it or bend it. They soon started to wonder if this had something to do with a nearby airbase. So they contacted Epley Airfield and Offutt Air Force Base. Not only did neither one of these have an idea what it was that had fell, they didn't seem to care too much. It was around this time that the police would get another call, which cited they had also seen a bright red object that had rocketed to the ground at the park. Not knowing what else to do, authorities took samples of the metal and sent it off to be analyzed, which eventually, the results came back showing that it was a simple high carbon steel made of a type common in manufacturing. In the meantime, the fire department loaded most of it onto a truck and took it back to the station, leaving a few pieces behind which were picked up by local residents and held on to as souvenirs. And that's pretty much it to this mystery. What in the world brought this molten metal here? The first theories were obvious. It was a meteor. But no, meteors are not metal, they're rock. Maybe it was an aircraft then. Well, the problem with that line of thinking is that it was in a semi-molten state. Some suggested that it was a satellite that had fell from space. But that was ruled out too, since satellites are made with a lightweight metal that has a high alloy content. They also looked at space junk, but the problem there was there should have been an impact crater, and there was none. There were other suggestions that were a little plausible, but still didn't make complete sense. There was a railroad track that ran nearby, but it was 50 yards away from where the molten metal had been dumped. There were even 2 smelters that operated in Omaha just about 5 miles down the road, which totally could have produced what was found here, but that ignores the obvious issue. The assistant fire chief stated there was about 1,000 pounds of molten iron on the ground when he arrived, and for it to have been in the state that it was, it would have had to been near 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Actually, the Journal of Scientific Exploration would later state that it would have been closer to 2,500 degrees when it was found. So, how did someone transport that down a heavily traveled road and dump it in the middle of the park? And there's also the question of those 4 to 8 witnesses who stated they seen it falling from the sky, from some kind of aircraft. While 11 witnesses in total, a few of these police officers and firefighters confirmed that there was molten metal on the ground. So what happened? Crazily enough, some people still believe it was a hoax. In fact, the 4 teenagers that were allegedly driving around when they seen the fire fall from the sky and then drove over to the park were suggested to be the culprits behind it, although I have to disagree. Apparently, these teenagers only stopped briefly to ask the other bystanders if they saw something fall from the sky too. When the others acknowledged that they had, the teenagers drove off, because they apparently did not seem interested in something rare as glowing molten metal in the middle of the park. So, according to this theory, they must have been responsible for it, and probably shot a flare into the sky to create the illusion of something falling. Like I said, I don't really believe this one, and that's because it ignores the question of how they got a substance that was nearly 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit to this spot, especially if they were driving the tiny car they were seen in. Of course, the supernatural theory is that it was aliens and a UFO, of course. Dr. Jacques Vallée stated that he had uncovered at least 9 other similar incidents where an alien craft ejected molten metal to the ground, which may have been a byproduct of the alien craft in distress or malfunctioning. And finally, although the military denied having any involvement, it's possible that they were working on some experimental aircraft or classified project, but considering they didn't seem that concerned, it kinda dismisses that theory too. December 3rd, 1967, Ashland, Nebraska. Police officer Herb Schirmer was on his night patrol around 2:30 a.m. on a particularly cold Nebraska morning, and while he was making his rounds like any typical night, this patrol would be unlike any other the young officer would ever have, because as he was driving, he would slow down and come to a stop, where he seen lights flashing in the dark. He at first thought it was a truck that had stopped in the middle of the road. It appeared as if the driver was flashing his headlights, possibly due to an emergency. But as Officer Schirmer got closer, this thing sitting in the road flew off. He would casually note in his official report, "I saw a flying saucer at the intersection of Highway 6 and 63, which makes it sound like this was something that happened every day. However, what wasn't noted was what happened afterwards, because Officer Schirmer got a terrible headache and heard a buzzing sound that just would not stop. It would be after he got home and was finally able to sleep that he woke up later that day and discovered a red bump below his left ear. But it wasn't just that. Schirmer soon realized that after seeing this thing fly off into the sky, he had no memory of what had happened for about 20 minutes in that time frame. And although he tried to remember the details of that night, he could never recall. Because of that, he decided he needed to see a psychologist, and he found one. A Dr. Leo Sprinkle, who specialized in hypnotic regression. He would set up an appointment with Schirmer, who made the drive to Wyoming to see him. And after the two met and started their session, Dr. Sprinkle would put him under hypnosis. It was here that Schirmer started to remember bits and pieces of that night. First, he would tell the doctor that his car's radio and engine had just stopped for no apparent reason. And then a white object emerged from the light in the road and began to speak to him telepathically. The being claimed that he was from another world and they had came to stop people from destroying Earth. Schirmer was stunned, as anyone would be, and he had to know more. So after the session, he scheduled a second one with Dr. Sprinkle, which led to more details. Soon, they would meet again, and under hypnosis, Schirmer revealed that this craft was made of a type of metal and had a football-like shape. He specifically remembered its exterior was gleaming. He also felt this overwhelming urge to run, but felt like he was mentally being held back. That's when this being, whom he can now recall more details of, emerged. He stated that it was clad in coveralls and adorned with the winged serpent emblem. The being then directed a greenish gas towards Schirmer's police cruiser, and that is when he seen a bright light flash and passed out. He would wake up minutes later to find himself aboard the craft, in which he explained he saw many computers and control panels. He said the aliens then explained that their spaceship worked on electromagnetism and got its power from big bodies of water. They also noted that radar and ionization made the ship less useful, and they decided to let him go, but not before telling him to not tell anyone about their meeting. They also stated they would come back a couple of more times, which they never did. Schirmer would actually draw a sketch of the figure, which he claimed was not completely human, and was shorter than a typical adult, and if this had just been anybody else's story, he would have been completely forgotten. But considering this was a police officer, It, of course, brought attention and a little bit of credibility in the UFO world, although it didn't go that far in the law enforcement world, since he would soon be relieved of his job shortly after the story came out. And despite that, and despite the constant ridicule he got, he never changed his story, all the way up until his death. So what exactly did Schirmer see, assuming he did have an encounter? Let's start with the mundane and work our way down. The most skeptical theory is he was experiencing sleep paralysis, or maybe hypnagogic hallucinations, which could pretty much explain all that he witnessed. Being on a quiet rural road may have triggered a hallucinatory experience for him. These events typically happen in the early morning hours, so that makes sense. But there's an issue with this one. First of all, when he was under hypnosis, he was able to provide a very detailed and very consistent account of the encounter, which would be difficult to do if it was just a brief sleep-induced hallucination. Not to mention, there were other reports of UFO sightings in the area that night. Next, we go to experimental aircraft. This was at the height of the Cold War, and some have speculated that this whole encounter was nothing more than a military test. It's possible that he's seen a secret military aircraft or drone that he mistook for a UFO, and the so-called beings were really just human pilots in advanced flight suits or uniforms, and the so-called telepathic communication he thought he received might have been nothing more than gestures. In fact, there were nearby military installations. However, the craft Schirmer described was way more advanced than anything we know about, at least publicly know. But I know you all want to know the strange theory, that yes, this was an extraterrestrial visitation. I really don't have to go into why this is a theory. I mean, you already know. His account mirrors other abductee stories, but there's just no proof for it. The craft didn't leave any evidence on the road where it allegedly landed. Schirmer's account was almost too close to some of the more popular accounts going around at the time, which suggests he just copied it from what he heard on TV or read in a book. Likewise, hypnosis is notoriously unreliable and prone to creating false memories based on the suggestion of the hypnotist or the subject's expectations. January 4th, 2004, Aurora, Indiana. A 17-year-old high school student, who elected to keep his name private, would have a very strange encounter this winter night around 7:30 p.m. The teen was driving down a country road near town when his headlights soon caught a glimpse of something unexpected. There, on the side of the road, on the passenger side of the car, was a figure crouched down near a puddle. He would pass by and get a closer look at this frail-looking figure and slowed down as he passed and peered at it in the rearview mirror, where he could make out its outline with the taillights of the car. It was then that this thing stood up, and he noted that it was a tall, abnormal figure, around 6.5 foot tall, that seemed to have pointed joints which seemed to buckle out. That being, when it moved, did so in a strange manner. That's when he would go on to describe it as being dark gray or black in color, pencil thin, and was wearing no clothing. The figure then began to walk on two legs towards the woods near the roadside. He stated that he could not see a face or eyes, but he got the feeling that this thing was staring at him. At this point, the young man would roll to a stop at a safe distance away where he would watch the thing more. It's about that time that another car approached from the opposite way, and the nervous teen watched to see what would unfold. He would see this other driver move along to where the 17-year-old had last seen this strange being moving around. That's when he noticed the other motorist make an evasive maneuver, stop, and then turn the car around and drive back up to where the teen had been parked. They would pull up around him, and an elderly couple got out and walked up to the teen and asked, "Boy, did you see something back there?" It was no human being. It was no man. The boy went on to say that the couple were really spooked by the whole thing, and they offered to follow him on his way to his destination at his friend's home. Once he arrived, he frantically called his mother and told her to lock the doors since the sighting had occurred within 3 miles of their home. As the night wore on though, the kid became hysterical and began calling this being an alien. His uncle, who did not hide his name, a man named Jerry Skadell, would then get involved and told him there had to be a much more simpler explanation and asked him to really think about it. And his nephew conceded that it may have been an improperly dressed elderly person, but still he claimed what he seen was a dark shadowy figure, and that if it was a person, they were super anorexic and were walking around naked in temperatures that were in 20 degrees Fahrenheit weather. Interestingly, Jerry, the uncle, would go to the spot of the encounter about an hour and a half after speaking to his nephew, and he did not see anything. The kid returned to the spot the next day too, once the sunlight was out, and he searched the area, but by this time, 4 inches of snow had fell, and even if there had been tracks, they were now covered. And it's worth noting here that Jerry is the only reason we know about this story, because he contacted a local UFO researcher and made an official report. The kid was also contacted after this, and the researcher stated that he seemed sincere about the encounter. The elderly couple were never found, and never came forward with their version of events. So what did he see? The main theory is just what his uncle said. It was a person, probably someone homeless or mentally ill, or maybe just lost, and was very malnourished. Yet, that doesn't explain how this person was unclothed or barely clothed in freezing temperatures. The second one is obvious. It was just dark, and the lights and shadows were playing tricks on the young driver's eyes. What he thought was a humanoid figure was just a tree shadow or something like that. But this is hard to believe if the elderly couple also seen this being. There's also the thought that it could have been a large animal that appeared to be skinny due to being starving or sick. It's even possible that it was a bear that stood up and walked on 2 legs, but there were no tracks of it or any signs that an animal had been there. And of course, we have to take a look at the supernatural explanations. The big one being, this was an alien of some kind, which explains a lack of clothing or facial features. Of course, squatting at the puddle of water and walking into the forest seems dumb for such an advanced being. Other theories include a cryptid, ghost, or straight up hoax. On the Friday evening of August 15th, 1969, Burlington, Iowa, 48-year-old real estate agent Dorothy Miller would receive a call from a potential buyer of a home located in town. Dorothy, who was the first and only realtor in Burlington, happily accepted the request to go let the man into the home, but she made the cautious decision to take her husband Fred along. Actually, she refused to show properties alone to anyone once nighttime hours began. Now the man had identified himself as a Robert Clark, and he asked Dorothy if she could pick him up at a local pharmacy and give him a ride over to the property. So the Millers did just that, meeting Robert at the pharmacy, which sat near a local tavern that would prove important later on. After touring the property, the Millers took Clark back and dropped him off at the pharmacy where they had picked him up. They found the man pleasant to talk to. As he relayed, he was moving his young family from Des Moines to Burlington, where he had just gotten a job he did not elaborate on. However, he did not make a decision that night, and instead called Dorothy again the next day, a Saturday, and stated he would like to go back to the property to take pictures so he could take them back to his wife to show, and asked Dorothy if she could meet him at the property that night, but she already had plans she could not break, and instead suggested they get together on Monday night at 7:30. The man agreed and told Dorothy he would be at the bar near the pharmacy, known as the Maple Leaf Tavern. He gave her the number and said for her to call it and ask for him. And this is where things get really weird. First of all, those other plans that Dorothy had? Yeah, she actually planned on showing another man a plot of land that night, which everyone found weird because, as mentioned before, she would never go out to meet a prospective buyer at night without her husband. What made it even weirder was Dorothy did not know this man, so it wasn't Robert that she had just met the night before. Furthermore, this plot of land was well out in an isolated rural area. However, it would get that much weirder when this potential buyer did not show up. Dorothy, however, did not think much of it and went on about her business. And when Monday came around, she met with a few buyers to show some properties and wrapped her last showing up a little after 6:30. It would be then between 7 and 7:30 that she would finally call the Maple Leaf Tavern and ask to speak to Robert. Robert was notified, and he walked up and took the call, walked to his black pickup truck to get something out, and walked to the pharmacy where Dorothy picked him up. Now the reason Dorothy's husband did not accompany her was because he drove a truck for a living and routinely laid down by 8:30 at night because he had to wake up at 5 a.m. Plus, after meeting Robert, they felt like everything checked out and neither one of them was worried. Because of these reasons, he did not drive out with Dorothy, and that decision would come back to haunt him. Because by 5 a.m. the next morning, when his alarm clock went off and Fred awoke, he rode over to see Dorothy was not in bed. A quick search of the home took place before he called their daughter to see if maybe she was over there. When they both realized she was missing, they immediately went to the property she had scheduled to show Robert the night before, and they seen nothing out of the ordinary. So they decided to drive over to the pharmacy where she had picked up Robert days ago, and there sat Dorothy's car. They both got out and looked to see the key was still in the ignition, and strangely, a camera flash cube was on the front seat, an item that was used in the 60s to take pictures in low light or in quick succession. Now, knowing what else to do, Fred and his daughter Dorothy went to the police, and the first place to search was the obvious, the property that she had taken Robert to look at. So investigators went over, and it was here on the second floor of a bedroom closet that they found Dorothy. It appeared she had been struck in the head after the two entered the home. The killer then tied her hands, pulled off her undergarments, and sexually violated her. He then dragged her to the closet, where he then stabbed her 22 times in the face, neck, and back. Detectives would later describe the murder as sadistic, and noted it was a well thought out crime showing sophistication. Detectives started close to the home and worked outwards. First, they spoke to neighbors who stated at 8 p.m. they had been sitting on the porch when Dorothy and a man fitting the description of Robert pulled up in Dorothy's car. Although they never seen anyone leave, they do look out later and notice the car was gone. Even stranger was there had been no cries for help or any sounds of a scuffle. The detectives continued house to house asking for information, but they didn't get very far. They did get a good description from Fred and some of the witnesses, which led to a sketch. He was said to be around 5'10", 175 pounds, good looking, clean cut, and between 20 and 30 years old. What evidence was collected was sent to the state-of-the-art laboratories at the FBI, and obviously, investigators were almost certain Robert Clark was a fake name. Likewise, no one in town recognized him. Even without a lot of evidence to go by, detectives still had a pretty good sound theory. They think the suspect found Dorothy's advertisement in town, or in a phone book, and new realtors usually go alone, and from that, he began making his plans. He was probably going to do it Friday night, but was thrown off when Fred came along as well. And it was probably at that point that he began spinning the story about needing a home for his young family because he was moving to Burlington. He was trying his best to convince them that he was a good family man, and it worked. They also believed while in the home, he unlocked the back door, which would give him a chance to return on the weekend and leave behind a brick that was thought to have been used to knock her out, along with some nylon rope that had also been found. And then after the crime, he walked out the back door, drove a car, and abandoned it near his vehicle and probably left town. He took a lot of time and effort to concoct this big story, almost like he enjoyed it as much as anything else. In fact, he did not even tell the Millers where he was staying, instead telling the couple to just pick him up at the pharmacy near the tavern, although it is possible he just told her he was driving to town and hanging out at the tavern until she was ready to go look at the home, and just decided to forego getting a room since Des Moines was only a couple hours drive away. Likewise, he also done this so Fred and Dorothy would never see his vehicle. It's only because of people at the tavern that we even know what he was driving, because they told police they seen him retrieve something from his pickup truck, a black pickup truck, and that item he took out was most likely a camera, which was to keep Dorothy from getting suspicious since he told her he was taking pictures of the home for his wife. This also explains the flash cube left behind in Dorothy's car, and taking that item was highly risky for a man who seemed to be so cautious, because these little items pick up fingerprints super easily, although I could not find if police did find them in this case, or if they did and the fingerprints just didn't match up with anything. Regardless, it was sloppy. And although investigators were a few years away from modern criminal profiling techniques that the FBI would become famous for, one man, a mental health care professional in Iowa, Harold Lee, was already doing early criminal profiling, and he believed the suspect was a serial killer, and Dorothy was probably not his first or last victim. He remarked how cunning he was, and how everything he did was methodical and basically left no clues. And that's really our first and main theory, that this was the work of a serial killer, who to this day has never been captured. And while that is crazy itself, there is a wild theory that connects Dorothy Miller's murder with another infamous one, that of Al Qaeda. And how in the world has anyone came to that conclusion? Well, that goes back to not only the meticulous planning done by the perp, but also the descriptions. Dorothy's suspect identified himself as Robert Clark, Al Qaeda as Robert Cooper. Both men were described as being 5'10" and 175 pounds with dark hair. The age is the key question in this one. If Robert Clark was closer to his younger 20s, like some witnesses reported, then he totally could fit Robert Cooper's estimated age of being in his 50s when he killed Al Qaeda, albeit it's still a stretch, as some of the witnesses described Qaed's killer as being in his 40s. Regardless, in both cases, the men played a character, Cooper as an Eastern European man on a cane, while Clark pretended to be a wholesome family man. The planning in both cases were very meticulous. However, there's never been definitive proof that links Dorothy's murder to anyone else's, which could rule out a serial killer. And that brings up the second most likely theory, just an opportunistic predator, a drifter. In fact, there was a carnival in the area at the time, and some speculate that it could have been someone from that, who arranged a meeting with Dorothy after seeing her advertisement, then left town with the show the next day. The problem with this one is, it took a lot of planning, and it doesn't come off as someone getting an idea after seeing an ad and then making all this up on the fly. July 3rd, 1978, Junction City, Kansas. 13-year-old Beverly Ann Ward would invite her 9-year-old friend to come have a sleepover after the two had spent the majority of the day together. Not to mention, the following morning, the two were expected to leave for summer camp. So that night, the girls would share a room with 2 beds and lay down to sleep. But early the next morning around 6 a.m., the family would be awoken to a startling sound. Across the street, a window would be shattered by someone throwing a brick through it. This, of course, led to a disturbance playing out in the neighborhood, and likewise, it woke up the Ward family, who all got up and went to the door and window to look out to see what was going on. Finally, the neighborhood disturbance died down, and the family decided to go back to sleep. That's when the family noticed everyone, including the little girl that had spent the night with the family, had gotten up to peer outside and see what was going on, except for Beverly. This, of course, made the family curious. Had she really slept through all of it? Well, they would get their answer when they stopped by her room to see she was gone. And after looking around the home and realizing she was nowhere to be found, the family called police, who dispatched some officers to the scene. And unlike other cases that take a while to develop, the officers found a major clue as soon as they pulled up. There, in the grass, about 10 yards away from Beverly's windowsill, was the screen that had been cut out from the window. They would go look over Beverly's room, where they found $12 in a bedroom drawer. $12 she intended to use for the camp they were going to. Detectives wasted no time in ruling it a kidnapping, partially because of the fact that Beverly, mental-wise, was a little bit younger than her years indicated, and she was deemed very vulnerable, so the thought that she may have cut the window screen herself and left was quickly ruled out. And because of all these facts, the FBI got involved quickly. They soon come up with a timeline too. They believed whoever had done this did so either at 3 a.m. or 5 a.m. How they came to that conclusion, I was unable to find, but it may have something to do with some witnesses that claimed an unknown car was parked at their house around those times, but because of the darkness, they couldn't make much out about it. And that was pretty much as far as detectives would get, and they faced an uphill battle right from the start. A major roadblock in this investigation was the city itself. Junction City at this time was known as a transient city with lots of drifters coming in through the area. They had so many people that would come in only for a day or two, or maybe a week or two, and leave, never having any real contacts in the area. So investigators started to fear the worst. They suspected one of these hundreds of drifters had seen Beverly playing with her little friend earlier that day, and made plans to come back that night and pull this off. And was conceivably several miles away by now, maybe even a state or two away, and, more than likely, kept moving, meaning tracking her down would be near impossible without a lucky break. Detectives were also confused by some other odd things like, how did the perp, or perps, pull her out of the window without alerting her friend? That girl was interviewed obviously, and she said she heard nothing at all the whole night other than the brick going through the window across the street. Which brings us to the next question. Was that related to this? Or just a random occurrence? Likewise, if people reported seeing the odd car next to the home, how did no one see a prowler moving around near the window? Or someone taking her to the car? These are questions that are still unanswered. Likewise, we don't have any suspects or persons of interest. Well, none that are known publicly at least. They did take in 3 different people for questioning though, but the only thing they had was these people just happened to be in the area at the time. Other than that, there was no hard evidence that suggested they were involved and they were let go. Now police have largely stuck to the belief that it was just somebody passing through town that took her, but there is a twist on this case that suggests something much darker, because a website known as spiritualabuse.org has actually covered her case. And what exactly is this site, and what's its connection to Beverly? Well, it's just as it sounds. It's a site that covers different types of abuse within churches, specifically the United Pentecostal Church, and the Wards were actually involved with the Pentecostal Church. It was known as Faith Tabernacle, and boy oh boy, does this go down a rabbit hole. First of all, was Beverly's future brother-in-law, who eventually led the church, and at one point would be arrested for doing, non-consensual things with someone who was not a legal adult. Then, his son would take over, who would also be Beverly's nephew, and he got in trouble for abusing some of the women at the church. And he also set these very strict rules on everyone who attended, and basically, everyone had their lives constantly monitored by this preacher. Not to mention, they would eventually kick Beverly's mom out of the church because they accused her of witchcraft. And yes, the Wards were attending this church when Beverly disappeared. And that's where things get stranger, because not only did this church not help search for her, or even offer to help in any way possible, they didn't even hold prayer for her. And in the years after this, Beverly's name was only spoken in hushed tones, and basically, the church discouraged anybody from discussing her case. Before we begin theories, I have to note that the family has been completely ruled out. Investigators are confident they are not involved. As far as what happened though, there are 2 basic lines of thought. The perp, probably a drifter, cut the screen out of the window, threw a rock through the window across the street. While the family was distracted with that, they grabbed Beverly and ran the opposite way. That one to me seems very risky, and I kinda doubt it. I tend to side with the theory that a stranger abducted Beverly after noticing her outside, going up to the window, cutting the screen, and leaving. And the brick going through the window was completely unrelated, and there are still those that believe the church was involved. In either case, police could never find any footprints that showed an intruder had even been around the home. 1995, Michigan, near the Canadian border, a hunter, ironically named Billy Hunter, was out with a group of friends deer hunting when he would get the encounter of a lifetime. As he hid in his spot, finally a group of deer would walk out in front of his path, and just as he started to grab his rifle, he noticed something further back. Behind the deer were rows and rows of trees, and in between the trees, he could make out something moving. Something huge. He would pull his rifle up, which had a scope attached to it. He peered through the scope to get a better look at what this huge creature was, way off in the distance. All of a sudden, his scope caught the movement of the deer, whom, all at one time, looked directly to the right. So he maneuvered his scope into the direction that they were looking, but he saw nothing. He slowly moved his scope back over to the deer, and when he did, he noticed some of them had started slowly walking away, while the others remained focused staring into the direction that they had been. And suddenly, the thing in the background caught his attention again. He saw it moving around, so he focused in on it, zooming his scope in. He would see it on a low branch of a very big tree, a tree covered in snow, which made it difficult to see the animal, because it too was stark white. It made it hard for him to track and distinguish what it was he was actually seeing. And while he's sitting there watching this, not for sure what he was really seeing, he noticed what he thought was a big piece of snow that seemed to crawl for a second. And suddenly, whatever this huge thing was landed heels first in the snow, and charged at the last few deer left behind. It was so quick that they didn't even have time to move. Now Billy was by himself, because the other hunters had taken up different positions, but they all stayed in contact via handheld radios, and they all see this playing out and begin panicking. Billy would recall that one of the men began trying to pronounce the scientific name of this huge bird because, from this angle, he thought that whatever this thing was had flew down from the tree. Then, the guy that they deemed the general of the hunt got on the radio and told everyone to mark their areas and told Billy the shot was his to take, since it was directly in front of him. So while this thing was attacking the deer, Billy pulls up to shoot, and hits it, he assumed anyways, because the animal never flinched and just kept attacking the deer. He was shocked. Not only could he not identify this animal, it seemed like the shot from this rifle had no effect, so he fired another shot, and finally, the animal turned and ran away. Billy would go on to state that he was for sure this was not a polar bear, which would make sense because that would be way out of their range. However, Billy could not identify what the animal was, other than stating it was some kind of hybrid, mixed between a polar bear, Arctic wolf, ape, and some kind of big cat. Specifically, he noted that it ran like a cat. He also described it as having thick white fur, black skin, and a flat face, with small ridges on its body like a reptile. And despite its huge body, it was surprisingly light on its feet. Strangely, he would also note that although it didn't stand on its hind legs, Billy suspected that it could. So what exactly did these hunters see that day? Well, it seems they encountered a cryptid known as the Booger bear, or bulldog bear. Animals that live mainly around the mountainous regions of the United States and Canadian border. They're noted for being very large and having characteristics of both cats and dogs, but are often compared to gorillas or lions. The first documented sighting occurred in 1956, and it actually ties back to a cryptid we discussed before, the living short-faced bear. This animal was very real, but it's supposed to have went extinct millennia ago. But some cryptozoologists believe a small population survived and could account for what Billy seen that day. Of course, the most plausible theory is they really just seen a bigger than normal sized bear that had been covered in snow and simply misidentified it. And we have to finish with another obvious one. This whole thing was a hoax. 1972, in the small town of Vergas, Minnesota, a 12-year-old girl, Cheryl Hansen, and her cousin, Jolene Hansen, had decided to spend this beautiful winter day snowmobiling in an area known as the Vergas Trails, which is a recreation area for bike trails, hiking, and the such. And it's on one of these 7 trails, which runs close to 200 miles, that the two would come up on an old desolate cabin. The two kids, much like any, found a way to have fun, and began circling around and around the old cabin when suddenly, someone ran outside to interrupt their fun. Actually, maybe I should say, something, because Cheryl, who was now an adult, would recall that this creature that ran out of the cabin towards them had very broad shoulders, and strangest of all, it was running barefoot through the snow. The young girls of course panicked and went back to tell their parents, who blew the whole thing off. This was only one of many accounts of the creature known as Hairy Man of Vergas Trails, which was mostly seen from the late 1960s to the early 1980s. The cryptid was often described as being an aggressive 8-foot humanoid weighing about 300 pounds that had shaggy long reddish-brown or black hair accompanied by a musky odor. It quickly gained a reputation for terrorizing residents and chasing people away, and its ferocious roar. And maybe most oddly of all, it was known to use tools or weapons like a stick, or in Cheryl's case, a hatchet. If true, the location would be perfect, because Vergas Trails is basically little traveled maintenance roads inside a hilly, densely wooded forest. Although the original sightings began in the late 60s, it's the 70s that the sightings became numerous, which I should point out is odd, considering there's only about 300 residents in this area. It was noted to be beast-like, yet very distinctly human, and tended to stay inside abandoned cabins, where it would often throw heavy objects like rocks at the occasional passing car, or, in a couple of occasions, jump on a vehicle and try to smash the driver's windows. The most famous account, though, came from a resident named Ken Zitzow, who used to hike the trails often and would come back to town one night all shaken up. And it's here he would tell other residents that while he was driving through the woods, a, quote, Bigfoot-looking thing walked out and hit his trunk hard enough to leave a dent. He, of course, did not hang around and got the heck out of there, and he did have a dent to show for it. While another resident, Dave Brune, claimed something similar, except in his account, the animal jumped on the hood of the car, forced him to begin swerving back and forth, which dislodged the creature. While resident Mike Quast allegedly seen the creature in 1976 near a lake, and went on to make plaster casts of the footprints left behind. But it wasn't just humans that it harassed, it was also believed responsible for an uptick in the deaths of livestock and pets. Now, as mentioned, the sightings basically stopped in the 80s, outside of a few cases here and there, and the whole thing would be easy to write off as an urban legend, or maybe even a hoax. Except in this one, we do have a piece of evidence, or maybe I should say, alleged evidence, possibly linked to this mysterious cryptid, found in an area known as Klondike, aka the old Vergas Trails, where the original hairy man sightings took place. A weird-looking skull was found. This skull, while looking humanoid, doesn't look human nor primate. It does have eye sockets, teeth, and 3 to 4 vertebrae still intact, and also has vegetation stuck to the back of the skull, which suggests that it was found in a swampy area after laying there for quite some time. Which brings up another question: how and when was it actually found? That is still a mystery as well. The man that currently owns the weird skull was not the individual that found it, but insists that the family that held on to it for years gave it to him. And, maybe not so strange, this man has decided to remain anonymous. Although it has never been officially tested, scholars who have looked at it quickly point out that the skull's cavity isn't large enough to hold a brain which would resemble a human's. And while it could be hoaxed, without proper tests being conducted, it's impossible to say. But it has been noted that if it was fake, it's one of the best they've ever seen, which again is odd for a town of 300 people. But what if this cryptid tale actually has some merit? What if it's well grounded in some kind of truth? Well, that may actually be the case, because there was another type of sighting on the Vergas Trails that put fear into people on more than one occasion, and that was a hermit. This man apparently took up residence in the woods of Vergas Trails for decades and was known to run out and harass and get aggressive with passerbys that he claimed was on his family's land. This man was very unkempt and had long and straggly hair, and I imagine did not smell very good. According to the story, much of the land surrounding the area had belonged to his family at one point, and when he was growing up as a young man, he was kicked out of the home, or left on his own, and just lived on the property in the woods. However, the family years later would sell that property and move away, and the kid, now a man, still lived life as a hermit on what he thought was his family's property. How much of that part is true is unknown, but one key part to the story is he tended to wear furs to deal with the harsh Minnesota winters. However, for the witnesses who had seen this creature, they still claim he was not a homeless man. So what is it? One of the prevailing theories is an unusually aggressive bear that possibly had mange, giving it a more human-like appearance, especially when standing up. However, that doesn't explain its ability to use tools or weapons. Of course, we can also go back to the ever so reliable theory that it was an escaped primate from a private zoo. Maybe someone owned a chimpanzee or gorilla that somehow escaped, or become a burden to the owner who just released it. But the problem here is, these types of animals would almost certainly not be able to survive a harsh Minnesota winter. But maybe the most likely theory is, in spite of people claiming it was not someone living in the woods, it was indeed a hermit. Maybe he was mentally ill and just moved from cabin to cabin. That has even happened before. We know specifically that Christopher Knight was doing that exact thing in Maine from 1986 to 2013. The only problem here is, there's no 8-foot hermits walking around, and you can almost guarantee that. That might have been added on to later by local folklore. Of course, none of that explains the skull. August 31st, 1944, Mattoon, Illinois. A man named Urban Rafe would wake early in the morning after he was disturbed by a very strange odor. This scent, whatever it was, began to nauseate him and made him feel very weak, and it only got worse because he soon began vomiting. His wife, now awake, assumed there must be a gas leak. She decided to get up and go to the kitchen to check out the pilot light on the stove, but when she attempted to get out of the bed, she felt partially paralyzed and could not get up. This was the beginning of a set of bizarre gas attacks that would play out over the next few days. Actually, it would be only a few hours later when a neighbor of Rafe's was awoken by the sound of her daughter coughing, but she could not make it to check on her because she was also unable to get out of the bed. This was followed the next day when Eileen Carney, who lived about 5 miles away, would report smelling a strong sweet scent around 11 p.m. She at first thought it was flowers outside the window, but as it got stronger, she lost a feeling in her legs. She began to panic and called her sister, who was also in the home. She could also smell the odor and was able to determine it was coming from the open bedroom window. And in this case, the police were called. By the time they made it to the residence, they found no one outside and no evidence that anyone had been near the window. But as soon as police left and wrote the whole thing off as a hallucination, an hour and a half later, at 12:30 a.m., Bert Carney, Eileen's husband, came home from work to see an unidentified man hiding close to one of the windows of the house. Bert got out of his taxicab and pursued the individual, but lost him in the dark. He also called police and told them the prowler was a tall man in dark clothing wearing a tight-fitting cap. When they arrived the second time and talked to Eileen, she stated this time there was a burning sensation on her lips and throat, which of course, police speculated was due to the gas that this person had been releasing into their home. By now, the story was reaching the media, and soon, the person became known as the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. And although the media was blowing the story out of proportion, speculating on what this crazy individual was up to, police had a more mundane theory. They believed it was nothing more than a botched burglary attempt. See, at the time, the Carneys had a large sum of money in their home, and just by chance, Eileen and her sister had been counting it earlier that night, right in front of the window. Police believed the prowler was out then and spotted them, which prompted him to try to pull off this gas attack, which failed. He then returned at 12:30 to attempt it again and was busted by her husband Bert. However, if this was nothing more than an ordinary thief, he was very determined, because over the following days, there were half a dozen similar attacks, and while detectives could never find any evidence that this prowler really existed, they caught a break 4 nights later when a Carl and Beulah Cordes would return home at 10 p.m. After walking inside and begin getting ready for bed, they noticed a white piece of cloth sitting on the porch next to the screen door. It was slightly larger than a man's handkerchief, and Beulah was curious, so she picked it up and smelled it. As soon as she did, she became violently ill. She would later tell the police it felt like she had suffered an electric shock. Her face began to swell, and she had a burning sensation in her mouth and throat, made worse by the vomiting, weakness, and partial paralysis in her legs. She would later suggest the reason that the cloth had been left there was to knock the family dog out so the burglar could break in without the dog barking. In addition, a skeleton key was found on the sidewalk next to the porch, with a large empty tube of lipstick. Detectives took the cloth and sent it off for chemical analysis, which found nothing. But coincidentally, shortly after this reported incident, another resident, who just lived a couple of minutes down the road, a Mrs. Leonard Burrell, seen a stranger trying to break in through her bedroom window. When he was spotted, he attempted to gas her before fleeing. By this time, it was becoming a national story, and soon the FBI got involved. The local police then put out a statement that citizens should avoid lingering in residential areas, as well as telling the vigilante groups to disband because it was a safety issue. But now that everyone knew what was going on, and they began to pay more attention to the surroundings, more physical evidence came in, like footprints being found under residents' windows and tears being found in window screens. The police obviously were overwhelmed. Most of the calls were citizens who claimed to smell gas or seen a prowler, and before long, with no real tangible evidence, police shut down the investigation. claiming the whole thing was mass hysteria, partially due to women living by themselves while their husbands were abroad in World War II. In fact, the police chief threatened that anyone who reported another gas attack would be forced to undergo a medical examination to prove they were affected by the gas and possibly face arrest for a false report. After this, the reports decreased dramatically, with only one police actually looked into when a woman claimed to have seen the gasser and, surprisingly, it was a woman dressed as a man. After that, the mad gasser of Mattoon vanished as quickly as he burst onto the scene. Now, we only covered some of the more credible reports that the police got, but there were a ton more of these. We just don't have time to cover each one. And there's also the fact that the mad gasser probably didn't exist. Within weeks of the whole affair, the local commissioner of public health, Thomas Wright, stated that although there had been a few gassing incidents, most of these were due to hysteria, usually waking up to an out-of-place odor or seeing a shadow at the window, etc., etc. Just a few days later, the local police chief took it even further and suggested there had not been any gas attacks at all, and instead, it could all be blamed on chemicals carried by the wind from nearby industrial facilities. Not to mention, this was during World War II, when the fear of invasion, spies, and chemical warfare was a very real thing. And basically ever since, this case has been a key example in the study of mass hysteria. However, that ignored the things like the soaked cloth, the window screens being cut, footprints being found, and multiple sightings of prowlers. So many believe that some of the attacks did occur early on, and then the rest was due to mass hysteria. In fact, there was even one person that residents in later years began to suspect, a local recluse named Farley Llewellyn, a man known as a belligerent drunk who kept a secret laboratory where he experimented with chemicals. And it did not remain a secret. After he accidentally blew up the lab, he would even end up being sent to a mental hospital. Of course, there's no direct evidence that links him. And of course, you get those unexplained phenomena types like it was some sort of extraterrestrial being, since some of the accounts, the witnesses claimed there was a strange buzzing noise, and also the appearance of a blue vapor. And finally, some believe it was the work of several pranksters. This brings us to the conclusion of this installment of Midwestern Unsolved Mysteries. I hope you guys enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.